Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Settle in, dim the lights, grab that comfy blanket, and let's just ease into tonight's tale. We're going to drift through a story that honestly feels like something out of a particularly strange dream you have after eating too much cheese. No need to sit up straight, no need to focus too hard. Just let my voice and the curious twists and turns of history wash over you. Tonight, we're talking about a man who managed to pull off one of the most audacious and, frankly, ridiculous cons in history. Not once, but twice. Yes, we're delving into the curious case of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Our story begins, as so many do, in a world just starting to grapple with the dizzying pace of modernity, a world where grand structures like the Eiffel Tower had only recently scraped the heavens. It was the early 20th century, a time of flappers and jazz, of burgeoning industrialism and apparently incredibly gullible scrap metal dealers. Our protagonist, or perhaps our antagonist, depending on your perspective, was born in Czechoslovakia in 1870. His name, if you can believe it, was Victor Lustig. And yes, Lustig actually means funny or jovial in German, which feels almost too on the nose for a man who made a career out of elaborate pranks on the unsuspecting wealthy. Victor, from an early age, seemed to possess that certain spark, that glimmer in his eye that suggested he wasn't going to be content with a quiet life. He was intelligent, charming, and had a facility for languages, eventually mastering 5 of them. These, of course, are excellent qualities for a diplomat, a scholar, or, as it turns out, a world-class con artist. He wasn't just good, he was exceptionally good. He was the kind of person who could sell ice to an Eskimo, or, as we'll soon discover, the Eiffel Tower to a Parisian businessman. Before his grand Parisian escapades, Lustig honed his craft in a rather unconventional setting, transatlantic ocean liners. Ah, the golden age of travel, where the wealthy and the naive were often cooped up together for days on end, just ripe for the picking. Lustig developed a series of scams, often involving a rigged card game or a money printing machine, a rather ingenious contraption that supposedly duplicated banknotes. Of course, it didn't actually print money, it was a clever box that would slowly duplicate one real bill inserted by the mark over several hours. The machine would dispense one real bill, convincing the mark it worked, and then Lustig would sell them the machine for a tidy sum, promising them untold riches. By the time they realized they'd bought a fancy wooden box, Victor was usually long gone, charming his way into another first-class cabin on another luxury liner. He was a man of leisure, always impeccably dressed, always exuding an air of sophistication and trustworthiness. Because, of course he did. That's how these things work. His reputation, or perhaps his legend, began to spread through the underworld, and probably through the polite society he so skillfully exploited. But it was in 1925 that Victor Lustig decided to aim for something truly monumental. He set his sights on Paris, the City of Lights, a city renowned for its beauty, its culture, and apparently its susceptibility to an absurdly bold swindle. Now let's talk about the Eiffel Tower for a moment. Built for the 1889 World's Fair, it was initially met with a fair bit of public disdain. Many Parisians considered it an unsightly monstrosity, a temporary eyesore that ruined the city's aesthetic. Even Gustave Eiffel, its creator, probably didn't imagine it would stand for centuries. The general sentiment, even in the 1920s, was that it was a bit of a relic, a terrible, expensive maintenance headache for the city. This widespread grumbling, this low hum of discontent, was music to Victor Lustig's ears. It provided the perfect, albeit incredibly shaky foundation for his master plan. Lustig, ever the meticulous planner, gathered as much information as he could about the Parisian government, and specifically the department responsible for public works. He learned that the cost of maintaining the aging iron structure was indeed a frequent topic of debate among city officials. He also discovered that due to political squabbles and budget constraints, public projects often moved at a glacial pace, shrouded in layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. This, my friends, was his in. He then forged official-looking stationery, complete with the appropriate government seals and letterheads. He dispatched letters to 6 of the most prominent scrap metal dealers in Paris, inviting them to a highly confidential meeting to discuss a matter of utmost national importance. The letters were phrased with just the right blend of officialese and urgency, hinting at a top-secret government initiative that required discretion above all else. Because, of course, dismantling the most iconic landmark in France would be a matter of discretion. The scrap metal dealers, naturally, were intrigued. A government contract of this magnitude could make their fortunes. They arrived at the meeting, held in a plush suite at a fancy Parisian hotel. Lustig understood the importance of setting the scene, of projecting an image of authority and legitimacy. He introduced himself as Deputy General Director André Poisson, a name he just pulled out of thin air, presumably, and he had a rather startling announcement to make. He explained, in hushed tones, that the city of Paris had come to a difficult but necessary decision. The Eiffel Tower, despite its iconic status, was proving to be too expensive to maintain. Its structural integrity was a growing concern, and the cost of repainting it every 7 years alone was astronomical. The public, he lamented, was growing tired of the temporary eyesore. Therefore, the government had decided, with great reluctance, to dismantle it. Now, pause for a moment and consider this. The Eiffel Tower. Dismantling it. It sounds utterly preposterous, doesn't it? Like something out of a cartoon. And yet Lustig presented it with such gravity, such conviction, that these seasoned businessmen actually bought it. This speaks volumes about Lustig's charisma, certainly, but also about the cynical undercurrents of Parisian society at the time. The very idea that such a monumental symbol could be considered a burden was apparently not entirely unbelievable to these particular individuals. They had probably heard whispers, seen newspaper articles lamenting the tower's upkeep. Lustig simply magnified those whispers into a roaring, albeit incredibly fabricated, government decree. He stressed the secrecy of the operation. The public, he explained, would be outraged if they knew the truth too soon. The government wanted to avoid panic, protest, and sentimental outbursts. Therefore, the entire dismantling and the sale of its constituent parts, thousands upon thousands of tons of prime wrought iron, had to be handled with extreme discretion. The chosen scrap metal dealer would be bound by strict confidentiality agreements. This, of course, was merely a clever tactic to prevent any of the dealers from actually verifying his story with legitimate government officials. Because why would you verify a top-secret government project? That would just be rude, wouldn't it? Lustig then led the dealers on a private inspection of the Eiffel Tower, riding in a rented luxury car, pointing out areas of rust and general disrepair, all the while subtly assessing their individual levels of credulity. He spoke authoritatively about the logistics of the dismantling, the tonnage of iron, the complexities of the bids. He was, in essence, putting on a masterful performance, and his audience was completely captivated. After the inspection, Lustig invited the dealers back to the hotel for the submission of their bids. He allowed them a few days to prepare their proposals, giving them just enough time to feel the urgency, but not enough to dig too deeply into his story. When the bids came in, Lustig, after careful consideration, or more accurately after picking his mark, announced that he had chosen André Poisson. Why Poisson? Well, Lustig had sensed that Poisson, despite being a successful businessman, felt a certain insecurity, a desire to be accepted into the upper echelons of Parisian society. He also seemed particularly eager to secure such a prestigious, albeit secret, government contract. Lustig, ever the psychologist, played on these vulnerabilities. He invited Poisson to a private meeting where he revealed, with a sigh, that there was a small complication. This complication, as you might have guessed, involved money. Not for the Eiffel Tower, oh no, that was a done deal, but for Lustig himself. He explained that as a humble civil servant, his salary was rather modest, and he was struggling to make ends meet, especially with the demanding nature of his important government work. He hinted, rather broadly, that a gratuity or a bribe, he used more delicate terms of course, would be greatly appreciated to smooth over the final details of the contract. Now, this was a crucial step in the scam. By asking for a bribe, Lustig wasn't just trying to get more money, he was also testing Poisson's moral compass. If Poisson was willing to pay a bribe, it meant he was implicitly admitting complicity in a potentially shady deal. It would make him less likely to go to the authorities if something went wrong, because he would be admitting to a crime himself. It was a brilliant psychological maneuver, doubling down on the secrecy and solidifying Poisson's commitment to the deception. Poisson, eager to secure the massive contract, and perhaps also flattered to be brought into Lustig's confidence, agreed to pay the bribe. The exact amount isn't entirely clear, but it was a substantial sum, enough to comfortably set Lustig up for a good long while. With the bribe in hand and the contract for the Eiffel Tower supposedly signed, Lustig promptly boarded a train for Vienna, leaving a bewildered André Poisson to await the official dismantling schedule, which, of course, never came. It took Poisson a little while to realize he'd been had. The days turned into weeks, and no word came from Deputy General Director André Poisson. No wrecking crews appeared at the Eiffel. So now that we've seen how a cobbler's daughter from Devon managed to convince the English gentry she was a wayward island royal, let's float over to another corner of the globe, and another century entirely, to find someone who didn't have to invent a title, but certainly struggled with the reality of having one. We're moving from the sunny, slightly damp fields of Bristol to the stiff, velvet-lined corridors of the Spanish court. And if you thought Mary Wilcox had a complicated life, she has nothing on our next guest. Let's talk about a man whose family tree was less of a tree and more of a very sturdy, very tangled garden hose. I am, of course, talking about King Charles II of Spain. Now, if you're a fan of royal history, you probably know that European monarchs weren't exactly big on diversity when it came to their dating pools. They liked to keep it in the family. But the Spanish Habsburgs took this to a level that can only be described as statistically impressive. By the time we get to Charles II in the mid-1600s, the genetic bill was finally coming due, and it was a very expensive bill indeed. Charles was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, the court was, well, they were concerned. You see, while a normal person has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents, Charles's family tree had folded in on itself so many times that his inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than if his parents had been siblings. His father was his mother's uncle. His grandmother was also his aunt. It was a genealogical nightmare that would make a modern lab technician weep. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because obviously if the King of Spain can't speak until he's 4, can't walk until he's 8, and has a jaw so large he can't chew his own food, it couldn't possibly be the centuries of uncle-niece marriages. No, it had to be a curse. Someone must have put a spell on him, because why face the reality of your own choices when you can blame a disgruntled sorcerer? The description of Charles by his contemporaries is, and I say this with all the gentle, sleepy snark I can muster, not exactly flattering. He was tall and extremely thin, with a head that seemed a bit too large for his body. And then there was the jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw. It was so pronounced that his lower teeth didn't meet his upper teeth. He literally couldn't close his mouth. This meant he drooled quite a bit, which is not the most majestic look for the ruler of a global empire. But Charles, bless his heart, was doing his best, or at least he was doing what he could. He was raised in a world of absolute cotton wool. Because he was so frail, he wasn't really educated. They didn't want to tax his mind, so he spent his childhood being carried from room to room, surrounded by dwarves and jesters, playing with toys long past the age when most kids are learning to govern provinces. He was essentially a perpetual child in a very expensive, very heavy crown. When he finally came of age, and I use that term very loosely, it was time for him to marry, because the only thing the Spanish court wanted more than a healthy king was a king who could produce an heir, which, given the circumstances, was a bit like asking a toasted marshmallow to build a skyscraper. His first wife was Marie Louise of Orleans. She was French, she was beautiful, and she was absolutely horrified. When she first arrived at the Spanish court, she found a husband who couldn't really hold a conversation and a court protocol so rigid it made a funeral look like a rave. There's a story that Charles, in an attempt to be romantic, would try to show her his favorite things, which mostly involved his collection of relics, basically old bones of saints. Nothing says, "I love you," quite like a drawer full of 400-year-old finger bones. Marie-Louise eventually passed away, childless, and honestly probably quite relieved to be out of the situation. But the Spanish crown wasn't done. They brought in wife number 2, Maria Ana of Neuburg. Now, Maria Ana was a different breed. She was ambitious, she was loud, and she quickly realized that Charles wasn't exactly the one pulling the strings. The court became a battleground of the bewitched king's health. Doctors, priests, and exorcists were brought in. They literally performed exorcisms on him, convinced that his physical ailments were the result of a demon. They even made him sleep next to the mummified remnants of his ancestors, thinking the holy vibes would somehow fix his DNA. It didn't. It just made him very, very tired, and probably gave him some very weird dreams. Despite all the drooling and the bone collecting, Charles was actually a very gentle soul. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't cruel, he was just a guy who wanted to be left alone to look at his relics caught in the gears of a dying empire. He lived in a state of constant physical pain, yet he lasted until he was 38, which, considering his medical chart looked like a grocery list of genetic disasters, was something of a miracle. When he finally died in 1900, the autopsy report was, well, it's one of the most famous documents in medical history. The doctor wrote that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. Now, historians think that was a bit of poetic exaggeration to emphasize how cursed he was, but it paints a picture, doesn't it? The poor man was essentially a living ghost for most of his life. And the irony? His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that lasted 13 years, all because this one man, who just wanted to play with his toys and look at his saint's fingers, couldn't produce an heir. The entire continent went to war over the empty space he left behind. It's a sad, slow, quiet end to a dynasty that once ruled the world. The Habsburgs started with lions and gold, and they ended with a man who couldn't chew his own dinner. But let's not stay too long in the gloomy halls of Madrid. Let's float away, perhaps to a place where the royals were a bit more active, even if their activities were questionable. Let's move our focus to the frozen north, where a certain Russian empress was proving that being the great often involved a lot of very strange personal habits. So, after the heavy, velvet-draped tragedy of poor Charles the Bewitched, let's drift north. Let's head toward the biting winds of the Baltic, where the palaces are made of white stone and the scandals are, well, they're significantly more energetic. We're moving into the 18th century, to the court of a woman who didn't have a drop of Russian blood in her veins, yet managed to become the most Russian person to ever live. A woman who took a messy, dysfunctional empire and decided she was the only one capable of tidying it up. Tonight, we settle in with the one and only Catherine the Great. Now, Catherine didn't start out as the Great. She started out as Sophie, a minor German princess from a family so obscure they were basically the human equivalent of a participation trophy. But Sophie was smart. She was terrifyingly smart. At 14, she was sent to Russia to marry the heir to the throne, Peter III, and she quickly realized she had walked into a complete disaster. Peter III was, how do we put this gently? He was a man-child, and not the enjoys a hobby kind, but the is obsessed with playing toy soldiers in the middle of the night kind. He was obsessed with the King of Prussia, he hated Russia, and he reportedly spent his wedding night playing with dolls and practicing military drills on the bedsheets instead of, doing what royals are supposed to do to ensure the succession. Catherine, meanwhile, spent her nights reading Enlightenment philosophy and learning Russian until she collapsed from exhaustion. She was playing the long game. She realized that while her husband was busy court-martialing a rat, yes, he actually held a formal military trial for a rat that ate one of his wax soldiers, she could be winning over the hearts of the Russian people. The marriage was, understandably, a complete wreck. They lived in a state of mutual loathing that was so thick you could probably have carved it with a saber. Peter was loud, crude, and liked to wake Catherine up at 2 a.m. to perform drills. Catherine, in response, developed a very modern approach to her personal life. She began taking lovers, mostly tall, handsome military men who were much more interested in her than in toy soldiers. Eventually, Peter became emperor, and he was so bad at it that he managed to alienate everyone in Russia in about 6 months. He tried to make the Russian army dress like Prussians, which is a bit like asking a cat to bark. It just wasn't going to end well. Catherine, seeing the writing on the wall, decided it was time for a career change. In 1762, she donned a guard's uniform, hopped on a horse, and led a coup against her own husband. It was surprisingly quiet as far as coups go. Peter was arrested, and a few days later he died in a drunken brawl while in custody, which is historical shorthand for Catherine's friends took care of the problem. But the real meat of Catherine's story, the part that kept the gossips of Europe fueled for decades, wasn't just her politics. It was the sheer, breathtaking weirdness of her court. Catherine had a type. She liked her men young, tall, and, let's be honest, not necessarily as smart as she was. She didn't want a co-ruler. She wanted a companion who looked good in a uniform and knew how to follow orders. There's a persistent, very famous legend that her ladies-in-waiting would test her potential lovers before she officially took them on, like a royal quality control department. While historians debate the literal truth of that, it perfectly captures the vibe of her reign. She was the boss, she was the one in charge, and she treated her lovers like very expensive, very temporary decorations. One of her most famous favorites was Grigory Potemkin. They were the ultimate power couple, two brilliant, slightly unstable people who loved each other but couldn't stand to be in the same room for more than an hour. Potemkin was the one who allegedly built the Potemkin villages, those fake cardboard facades designed to impress the empress as she sailed down the river. Even if the villages weren't literally cardboard, the metaphor stands. Catherine's Russia was a place where image was everything. As she got older, Catherine didn't slow down, she just got more eccentric. She had a room in the Hermitage where the tables could be lowered through the floor into the kitchen so the servants wouldn't hear the royal gossip. She drank 5 cups of incredibly strong coffee every morning, coffee so potent it would probably give a modern barista a heart attack, and she wrote letters to Voltaire while her latest 20-something lover sat in the corner looking pretty. The tragedy of Catherine, if you can call it that, was the shadow she cast over her son, Paul. She hated him. She thought he was just like his father, the man-child Peter. She took his children away from him to raise them herself, creating a cycle of family trauma that would haunt the Romanovs until the very end. Paul spent his life waiting for her to die, terrified that she would disinherit him. When she finally did pass away, not on a toilet as the crude rumors suggest, but on a stroke in her dressing room, Paul's first act as emperor was to try and undo everything she had done. But you can't undo Catherine. She was a force of nature in a powdered wig. Let's float away from the cold marble of St. Petersburg now. Let's drift toward a slightly warmer, though much more claustrophobic setting. Let's look at a family that had all the money in the world, but couldn't seem to buy a single moment of sanity. George III was, by all accounts, a bit of a boring guy at the start. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't have a string of mistresses, and he actually liked his wife, Queen Charlotte. They had 15 children, because why not try to populate an entire continent with your own DNA? And for a while, life at Windsor was quite domestic and dull. George loved farming. He was nicknamed Farmer George because he'd rather talk about the rotation of turnip crops than the rotation of political alliances. But then the episodes started. Imagine you're a member of the royal court. You're walking through the gardens of Windsor and you see the King of Great Britain. You bow, expecting a polite nod about the weather. Instead, the king approaches a large oak tree, tips his hat, and begins a deep 30-minute conversation with it. He was under the impression that the tree was the King of Prussia. Now, when your monarch starts negotiating peace treaties with a shrub, the court tends to get a little twitchy. George's illness was a slow, agonizing drift into the fog. He would talk for hours until he literally foamed at the mouth and his voice went hoarse. He would repeat himself until the words lost all meaning, a symptom known as logorrhea. He wasn't just mad in the angry sense, he was hyperactive, his mind racing at a speed his body couldn't follow. And because this was the 1700s, the medical treatment for a confused king was, and I use this word with a deep sigh, barbaric. His doctors, who were basically guessing in the dark, decided that the best way to cure a royal brain was to torture the royal body. They used blistering, which involved applying caustic chemicals to his legs to create painful sores, thinking the evil humors would leak out. Spoiler, they didn't. They just made the king very, very grumpy. They also put him in a straitjacket and a specially designed restraint chair whenever he got too talkative. Imagine the king of the most powerful empire on earth strapped into a chair like a naughty toddler while his doctors argued over whether his urine was blue, which, strangely enough, it might have been. Modern historians think he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can turn your waste purple or blue and cause temporary insanity. But while George was in his room talking to the furniture, his son, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, was outside throwing the most expensive parties in history. The contrast was almost comical. The father was in a straitjacket eating plain gruel, while the son was spending the equivalent of millions of dollars on gold-trimmed snuff boxes and silk stockings that were so tight he had to be sewn into them. The Prince Regent was a Habsburg potato of a different variety. He was fabulously wealthy, incredibly vain, and so large that his corsets were under more pressure than a deep-sea submarine. He hated his father, and his father, in his moments of clarity, absolutely loathed him back. At one point, during a royal dinner, the king supposedly grabbed the prince by the collar and threw him against the wall, which, given the prince's size, must have been a Herculean feat of mad strength. As George III grew older, he went blind and deaf, retreating into a world of total silence and darkness. He lived out his final years in Windsor Castle, a long white beard flowing down his chest, playing the harpsichord and talking to people who had been dead for 50 years. He was a ghost in his own palace, a man who had once ruled the world, but ending his life wondering why the ghosts wouldn't answer his questions. It's a quiet, heartbreaking image. The old king, wandering the corridors in a purple dressing gown, playing a lonely tune on a piano, while the world outside moved on to the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution. He was a relic of an older world, kept in a gilded cage until the very end. But let's leave the foggy corridors of Windsor and float across the English Channel. Let's move toward a place where the royal drama was less about madness and more about obliviousness. Let's look at a young queen who just wanted to play dress-up while her kingdom was literally catching fire.